Hello everybody, it's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name, and I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. I looked forward to spending my mornings with warm, convivial people, from the receptionist in the small, well-lit foyer at the hospital, with her cheerful greeting of "It's no very nice today," as a flurry of wind-driven sleet blew me in through the hastily opened glass front door, to my classmates, all of us at varying stages of our pregnancies, who made me feel so welcome to their friendly group. We compared bump sizes and experiences of heartburn, and how many times we'd had to get up during the night to wee. And I felt as though these girls as well, I've lost my place. I felt as though I knew these girls as well as if I'd spent my life with them. We laughed and rolled about our mats as we practiced our breathing and pushing exercises. In the early 70s, our husbands weren't expected to join us as coaches in our prenatal classes, although they were becoming involved in the birth itself by being present at the delivery. It was an option that fathers were taking up, with some encouragement from obstetric staff in most hospitals. And though I hadn't yet broached the subject with Fred, whether he would be there while I gave birth, I was hoping he'd be keen on staying there with me. I had no idea what to expect in the delivery room, and had heard the usual hair-raising horror stories from various acquaintances. So I wasn't even sure that I wanted to be there. But Fred was a delicate soul, and I was going to broach the subject as gently as I could when the time was right. At the moment, he had enough to contend with his initiation to the intricacies of running Glen Cruton, and was looking more haggard each time he and his mother arrived back at the house at mealtimes. Fred could see I was losing my vitality, becoming enervated, and my old bouncy, outgoing personality had all but vanished, and it worried him too. His way of coping was to withdraw. It was his mechanism for self-preservation, a technique he'd perfected during his childhood. He was sent to prep school at the age of 5, boarding school, and adolescence when being bullied at Eton, and in order to escape his parents' overbearing control. Like him, I found myself becoming more and more subdued. I walked down to the kitchen garden to visit Bobby and Hamish in the hothouse, but they were only there twice a week at this time of the year. I envied Weenie, who struck out on her walks through the countryside, whatever the weather, embracing the cold wind, which made her cheeks so rosy. I'd never thought of walking in the pelting rain. In Africa, we just waited for the weather to clear, which might take a day at the very longest, and walked in the sunshine. Tramping around in a cold drizzle, icy rain, and sleet had no appeal to me, and I didn't want to stumble around in knee-deep, wet bracken as I became bigger and more ungainly. I took a walk around the big gardens every day for the exercise and to get me out of the oppressive house, but it was lonely. When it snowed, I went out and played by myself like an only child, making a snowman and then trying to knock its head off with snowballs. One afternoon, I was on the croquet lawn in the process of scooping up a handful of snow in my mittens when Bar and Fred appeared from around the other side of the tall trees growing next to the house, walking along the path leading to the lower terrace. "What on earth are you doing?" asked Bar in amazement. Like a naughty child, I instinctively hid my handful of snow behind my back and tried not to look guilty. Then I thought the hell with it and swung my arm around to hurl the snowball. It caught Fred on the shoulder and splattered over his coat. Momentarily, he looked astonished, and then he burst into laughter and lunged forward to grab both my hands before I could scoop up another load of ammunition. "Come on, I'll show you how to make a proper snowball," and he said, and took my hand, and we ran, slithering and sliding down to the ornamental Japanese garden, where the snow lay in deeper drifts. Bar stood on the path with her hands on her hips, watching us, and then just shook her head disapprovingly and walked back up to the house. In mid-January, Fred and I were invited to dinner by friends who lived in a colossal baronial castle nearby. He was a duke, I think, the Duke of Argyll, as I recall. They were old friends of the family and had daughters the same age as Fred. I had met them at our wedding reception, where they'd been so pleased to meet me and kindly invited us over to see them any time. We arrived at the massive front doors at 7 o'clock, and Sir Edgar and Lady Sarah welcomed us to their vast hall, far bigger than the Glencruton one, where there was a small and completely inadequate log fire glowing in the cavernous fireplace. It was well below freezing that evening, with a glittering frost already settling on the roads, and seemed even colder inside the castle. I was glad I'd worn the long-sleeved dark blue wool dress that I'd bought in the maternity shop in London. The Waterleys don't have central heating, so wear all the warmest clothes you can lay your hands on, Fred had warned me as he buckled the straps on his dress kilt when we were getting changed to go out. The castle must be early 16th century at the latest, and beautiful to look at, but seriously impractical to live in. Glencruton seemed quite cosy by comparison. We were led through to an enormous drawing room with towering walls, hung with a vast array of huge oil portraits of their ancestors, and given a glass of sherry. I could actually see my breath in the chilly, damp air as we sat perched on antique chairs, beautifully embroidered with petit point tapestry, to sip our drinks and talk. My feet, in spite of being encased in fleece-lined black suede boots, felt like lumps of ice, and I was extremely hungry and looking forward to some hot food to warm me up. Although Edgar and Sarah were Bar and Bob's contemporaries, they'd always enjoyed being involved in Fred and his sisters' and brothers' lives. They were kind and genuinely interested in us. They had no sons, just the two daughters, and told us all their news while we sipped our sherry. So Edgar and Sarah were both very tall, and he was lean and rangy with a big bony face, craggy eyebrows, and a huge hawk-like nose. Over his kilt he wore an ancient tweed jacket with leather patches on the elbows, which hung on him loosely and looked as though he'd spent the best part of 40 years wearing it in all weathers. Lady Sarah was elegantly emaciated and wore a soft, moth-coloured cashmere polo neck with her long kilt. Round her narrow waist she had on a fine gold chain, and her pale blonde hair, which was turning to grey at the temples, was twisted into a graceful, French, French pleat at her fragile neck. A butler in black tie came to the door to announce that dinner was served, and we walked eagerly to the gigantic dining room with vaulted stone ceilings, from which our voices echoed as if they would in a cathedral. Looking almost lost in there stood a long polished banqueting table, capable of seating 40 people with ease, and which was laid with 4 places. A great big china soup tureen with a lid and matching china ladle stood on a sideboard on the far side of the room, and the butler lifted it with some difficulty to carry it around the table, offering it to each of us in turn. There was a puddle of pale brown liquid lurking right at the bottom, and I scooped up a ladleful of what looked like coloured water into my bowl. Once we'd all been served, I took a spoonful. It was tepid and very weak, clear beef consomme, like Bovril soup, and gone in a couple of mouthfuls. After an interminable wait, my tummy growling with hunger by now, and while the Waterleys chattered animatedly to us, we were served with a plate, each on which was a single thin slice of toast with the crusts cut off. Perched on the toast was a tiny, shriveled-up cooked bird, its little toothpick-sized legs sticking forlornly up. "Ah, quail," said Edgar proudly. "Shot them myself this autumn. Here are the potatoes." And he passed a small bag of crisps, we call them chips in South Africa, to us. We sprinkled a few onto our plates next to the quail and passed the bag on. "Dig in." Lady Sarah picked up her fork and started sawing daintily at a microscopic wing. Strange, I thought to myself, 2 starters? And ate my quail as neatly as I could, trying not to get too many of the numerous little bones in both bites, while discreetly spitting several pellets of lead shot into my fist before placing them on the edge of my plate without drawing too much attention to the clattering noise they made as they rattled onto the fine bone china. We laid our forks back on the empty plates and waited for the butler to come back to remove them. They were delicious, I said to Sarah, and she patted my hand affectionately with her long, cool fingers. I'm so pleased you enjoyed your dinner, she replied. Quail is such a treat for us, you know. We don't bother with pudding here. Neither of us likes sweet things. But have some cheese, said Edward, beaming, baring his long aristocratic teeth at me, and pushed towards me a big wooden board with an enormous ornate, giant-sized china cheese cover on it. Fred and I both, still ravenous, leaned forward avidly as he lifted the cover. A piece of hard, cracked, dry cheddar, the size of a matchbox, sitting forlornly on the vast board, and not a biscuit in sight. I tried not to catch Fred's eye, and at the end of the long evening, after a thimbleful of tepid coffee drunk huddled next to a small fire, which burned reluctantly in the drawing-room grate, we thanked our hosts profusely and drove back to Glen Cruton over ice-slicked roads, our teeth chattering from the cold. Good grief, I'm starving, said Fred when we let ourselves back into the house. We hurried down to the kitchen and started foraging for food, any kind of sustenance. I was rummaging in the big fridge while Fred hacked slices off a loaf of bread. We sat near the nice warm Aga stove, cramming our roughly made sandwiches into our mouths and spluttering with laughter. I'd forgotten. It's so long since I've been there, chuckled Fred. We should always eat something substantial before we go to dinner with them, kind and dear as they are. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week. And thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.